The sun hung low over the capital city, casting a golden sheen on the gleaming iron gates of the imperial palace. The crowd outside buzzed with excitement, tourists snapping photos, children laughing as they waved at the motionless guards in their ceremonial uniforms. Alexander Royce, standing among his fellow sentinels, remained stoic. His uniform was impeccable, the dark blue fabric adorned with gold trim that shimmered in the sunlight. His eyes scanned the crowd with quiet vigilance, though his expression betrayed no emotion. Then the moment shattered. A hush fell as a man stepped forward from the gathering throng. Tall and broad, his face was twisted with contempt, his eyes locking onto Alexander with an intensity that felt like a challenge. The man, later identified as Victor Lang, moved with deliberate purpose, his footsteps heavy on the cobblestones. Without hesitation, he spat, a vile, hateful gesture aimed directly at Alexander. The wet sound of the spit landing was louder than it should have been, breaking the stunned silence like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the crowd, the shock palpable. Mothers pulled their children closer. Tourists froze mid-photo, their phones trembling in their hands. Alexander didn't move. Not at first. His training was as much mental as physical. Every fiber of his being told him to stay calm, to resist the surge of anger rising in his chest. Slowly, his dark brown eyes locked onto Victor's. His gaze was steady, unreadable, a glacier meeting a roaring flame. Victor sneered, leaning closer, taunting Alexander with his grin. The crowd waited, breathless, for what would happen next. Would the guard retaliate? Would he draw his sword? Alexander's hand moved, brushing against the hilt of his ceremonial blade. The faintest flicker of movement caused murmurs to spread through the crowd. A woman whispered, "This is going to turn ugly." And then the heavy oak doors of the palace creaked open. Captain Edmund Vance emerged, his authoritative presence instantly commanding the scene. "Guard Royce," he called, his tone calm but firm. "Stand down." Alexander straightened, his hand falling away from his sword. Captain Vance turned to Victor, his expression cold as steel. "You've just committed a crime. Assaulting a member of the Imperial Guard is punishable by law. Officers, take him." As Victor was dragged away, a child broke the silence. "Why didn't you fight back?" Alexander knelt to meet the boy's gaze, his voice calm yet resolute. "Because being strong doesn't mean striking out. Sometimes it means knowing when to stand still." The boy nodded solemnly as the crowd erupted into applause. Alexander resumed his post, his back straight, his heart a storm that no one could see. The morning air was crisp, sunlight streaming through the thin curtains of Alexander's modest apartment. The faint scent of brewed coffee mingled with the sounds of the city waking outside. A hum of cars, distant chatter, and the occasional bark of a dog. Alexander sat at the kitchen table, his hands steady as he polished his ceremonial boots. The rhythmic motion of the cloth against leather was meditative, a daily ritual that centered him before every shift. His wife, Eleanor, appeared in the doorway, her auburn hair loose over her shoulders. She held a steaming mug of tea, her brow slightly furrowed. "You've barely touched your breakfast," she said softly, setting the mug beside him. Alexander looked up, offering a faint smile. "Nerves don't taste good." Eleanor chuckled lightly, though the worry in her eyes didn't fade. She sat across from him, her fingers idly tracing the edge of the mug. "Another day at the gates?" He nodded. "It's routine. Tourists, photos, the usual." But Eleanor knew better. She understood the weight he carried, the silent battles fought against both external prejudice and his own doubts. Being the first black man in the Imperial Guard was a point of pride for both of them, but it had not come without its challenges. The scrutiny, the whispers, the stares, all of it had become part of their lives. She reached across the table, her hand resting on his. "Stay safe," she said, her voice tinged with a quiet plea. "I will," he promised, though they both knew safety was never guaranteed. Later that morning, Alexander stood at his post, his expression calm and unreadable as the city came alive around the palace gates. Tourists flocked to the area, snapping photos and waving eagerly at the stoic guards. Children giggled as they tried to make the guards laugh, their antics harmless and endearing. Alexander remained unmoving, his discipline unwavering. Across the street, however, Victor Lang watched the scene with a dark scowl. He leaned against a lamppost, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His disdain for Alexander wasn't subtle. It radiated from him like a storm cloud, his gaze fixed on the guard with a loathing that burned hotter by the second. Victor muttered under his breath, his words drowned out by the distant hum of the crowd. To him, Alexander's presence wasn't just an offense, it was a challenge. His clenched fists trembled with suppressed fury, the hatred inside him threatening to boil over. "This is sickening," Victor growled, his voice low but venomous. Fueled by his own bitterness, he pushed away from the lamppost and began to cross the street, shoving past tourists and cutting through the throng of onlookers. His target was clear, his resolve unshaken. Alexander saw him coming, but didn't react. His training had prepared him for moments like these, moments of provocation where restraint was both weapon and shield. He steadied his breathing, his gaze fixed ahead. Victor stopped directly in front of him, his eyes blazing. For a moment there was silence, a tense pause where the world seemed to hold its breath. And then Victor spat. The act was deliberate, dripping with malice. The glob of spit hit Alexander's face, sliding down the polished gold trim of his uniform. Gasps erupted from the crowd, the sound of shock reverberating through the air like a sudden clap of thunder. Alexander stood still, his chest rising and falling as he took a slow, measured breath. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a cloth to wipe his face, his expression unreadable. Inside, however, emotions raged. Anger, humiliation, and a deep sadness that this, too, was part of the duty he had sworn to uphold. Across the street, a mother whispered to her child, "Why would someone do that?" Alexander didn't flinch. He didn't lash out. He simply resumed his posture, his back straight, his gaze calm. But the storm within him was far from over. By the following morning, the incident had spread like wildfire. The video, captured by a tourist's smartphone, was everywhere, shared on social media, covered by news outlets, and debated in comment sections. The scene of Alexander Royce standing stoically as Victor Lang spat on him had become a symbol, interpreted differently depending on the viewer. For some, Alexander was a paragon of strength, his restraint embodying dignity in the face of hate. Others, however, saw his lack of reaction as weakness, a failure to confront injustice head-on. The polarized reactions were as swift as they were overwhelming. At home, Alexander sat at the small dining table, staring at his phone as the video replayed on its screen. He watched it silently, his face betraying nothing. His wife, Eleanor, stood in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly. "I can't believe this," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "He humiliated you in front of everyone. And now people are questioning your character?" Alexander set the phone down, letting out a heavy sigh. "People will see what they want to see," he said quietly. Eleanor crossed the room, her hands landing firmly on the table. "You didn't deserve that. None of it." He met her gaze, his expression softening. "I know, but reacting in anger wouldn't have helped. He wanted me to lose control. If I had, it wouldn't just be my uniform he disrespected, it would have been everything I stand for." Her fists tightened at her sides, tears welling in her eyes. I hate that you have to carry this weight. You shouldn't have to prove your worth to anyone." "I know," he said again, reaching for her hand. "But this job isn't just about standing guard. It's about showing people what strength really looks like, even when it's hard." Later that day, Alexander scrolled through the online reactions. Messages of support flooded in from strangers around the world, commending his composure. But mixed among them were vitriolic comments echoing Victor's hateful rhetoric. "Coward. Should have fought back. He doesn't belong there. Eleanor, reading over his shoulder, shook her head in disgust. Why even look at those? They don't deserve your time. Alexander sighed and set the phone down again. Because I need to understand what I'm up against. It's not just one man. It's a mindset. And if I'm going to face it, I need to know its shape. The resolve in his voice was firm, but Eleanor saw the weariness in his eyes. She placed her hands gently on his shoulders. You don't have to face it alone, she said. He nodded, grateful for her strength, even as he braced himself for the storm ahead. Victor Lang's venom didn't end with his arrest. Released on bail the following day, he wasted no time escalating his campaign of hatred. From his dimly lit basement, Victor recorded a series of videos, spewing his twisted ideology and mocking Alexander Royce. He's weak, Victor sneered in one clip, his voice dripping with contempt. People like him think they belong here, but all they do is stand there and take it, and I'll make sure everyone knows it. The videos gained traction among a small but dangerous corner of the internet. Encouraged by his growing audience, Victor's rhetoric became bolder, his threats more direct. At home, Alexander scrolled through the videos in silence, his jaw tightening with each hateful word. Eleanor stood behind him, her arms crossed, her face pale with worry. He's not going to stop, she said. He's obsessed. I know, Alexander replied, his voice steady, but he wants me to react. That's his goal, to pull me into his chaos. I won't give him that satisfaction. The next morning, Alexander woke to find a message on his phone. It was anonymous, brief, and chilling. Watch your back. He showed the message to Captain Edmund Vance later that day. The captain's expression darkened as he read it. This isn't just online hate anymore, Vance said. He's escalating, and that makes him dangerous. We're increasing security at the palace and your home. But Royce, be vigilant. Alexander nodded, the weight of the situation pressing heavier on his shoulders. That evening, as Alexander and Eleanor sat together in the living room, a loud knock reverberated through the apartment. They exchanged a glance before Alexander stood, his body tense, and moved cautiously to the door. Peering through the peephole, he saw nothing. When he opened the door, the hallway was empty. But a small package sat on the welcome mat, wrapped in plain brown paper. A chill ran down Alexander's spine as he picked it up and brought it inside. Don't open it, Eleanor said, her voice urgent. What if it's dangerous? Alexander carefully unwrapped the package, his hands steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. Inside was a photograph of himself in uniform, his face circled in red ink. Beneath the circle were 2 words, scrawled in jagged handwriting, soon. Eleanor's face drained of color as she read the message. This has gone too far, she said, her voice trembling. Alexander set the photograph down, his expression calm but his eyes blazing with quiet fury. It's meant to scare me, he said, to make me hesitate, but I won't. As the night deepened, Alexander stood by the window, staring into the darkness. The threat was closer now, more personal. He couldn't help but wonder how far Victor, or whoever else was behind this, was willing to go. But as fear crept in, so did resolve. He would not back down, not now, not ever. The morning was quiet at the Imperial Palace gates, the usual hum of tourists and passing traffic filling the air. Alexander Royce stood at his post, his posture as unyielding as ever. The unease from Victor Lang's threats lingered in the back of his mind, but his training kept him focused. His eyes swept over the crowd, noting familiar faces of regular visitors and the occasional tourist snapping selfies. And then, the world erupted. A deafening explosion shattered the tranquility, sending a shockwave through the gates. The air was filled with smoke, debris, and the terrified screams of bystanders. Alexander was thrown backward, his ears ringing as his vision blurred. The ornate iron gates of the palace, once pristine, now lay twisted and mangled. Pushing himself off the ground, Alexander's training took over. Everyone, get back, he bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. His fellow guards scrambled to evacuate civilians, ushering them to safety. Through the haze, Alexander's eyes locked onto a figure standing near the epicenter of the blast. Victor Lang. Victor held a remote detonator in one hand, his expression triumphant, as if savoring the destruction he had wrought. "You think you're untouchable, Royce," he shouted, his voice raw with hate. "Today, you learn what happens to people like you." Alexander's heart raced, but his face remained composed. He took a step forward, his voice steady despite the turmoil. "Victor, this ends now. Drop the detonator and surrender. You've done enough damage." Victor laughed, a sharp, manic sound that sent a chill through the air. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about you. This is about them." He gestured wildly at the crowd, many of whom were cowering behind parked cars or nearby walls. "They need to see what happens when their little symbols fall." Alexander's hand instinctively moved toward his sidearm. His every muscle was taut, his focus honed. But he knew the stakes. One wrong move could cost countless lives. Victor's thumb hovered over the detonator, a wild gleam in his eyes. "One more push, Royce. Just one. Show me what you've got." Before Victor could act, Captain Vance's voice rang out from behind. "Lang, drop it." The captain and a team of armed officers moved in swiftly, their weapons trained on Victor. But Victor didn't falter. "Back off, or I'll take this whole place down," he roared, his hand tightening on the detonator. Alexander took another step forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Victor, look at me. This isn't strength. This is cowardice. Hurting innocent people won't make you powerful. It'll just make you a monster." For a moment, Victor hesitated, his manic energy faltering. His thumb trembled, the weight of Alexander's words pressing against his resolve. But then his sneer returned, and he barked a bitter laugh. "I'd rather be a monster than nothing," he spat. Before Victor could act, a sharp crack echoed through the smoke. A sniper's bullet struck his hand, sending the detonator flying. Victor howled in pain, clutching his wrist as officers rushed in, tackling him to the ground. Alexander exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Around him, the crowd began to emerge from their hiding spots, their faces a mix of fear and relief. Victor was dragged away in cuffs, shouting incoherently. "This isn't over, Royce. You hear me? This is just the beginning." As the smoke cleared, Alexander stood amidst the wreckage, his uniform streaked with ash and debris. He looked toward the gates, now a symbol of both destruction and resilience. Captain Vance approached, placing a firm hand on Alexander's shoulder. "Good work out there. You kept things from getting worse." Alexander nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's not over," he said quietly. "Not for him. Not for others like him." Vance's expression darkened. "No, it's not. But today, you saved lives. Don't forget that." As the sirens wailed in the distance and the crowd began to disperse, Alexander resumed his post, standing tall. He knew the battle wasn't over, but he also knew one thing for certain: he would not be broken. Victor Lang's arrest brought momentary relief, but the aftermath revealed a far more insidious threat. As investigators combed through Victor's devices and communications, they unearthed troubling evidence. Victor wasn't acting alone. He was part of a larger, coordinated network of extremists. The mastermind behind the group was a figure known only by the alias the Architect. This shadowy leader operated from the shadows, orchestrating hate-fueled campaigns aimed at dividing communities and inciting chaos. Each layer of Victor's connections revealed another web of operatives, encrypted messages, and coded plans for future attacks. At a late-night briefing, Captain Vance stood before a room filled with intelligence officers, guards, and city officials. A map of the city was projected onto the wall, red markers indicating areas where the network had already begun to spread its influence. "This isn't just about Victor Lang," Vance said, his tone grim. "He's a pawn in something much bigger. The Architect has been planning a large-scale attack, and their target is the city itself, Our intel points to the upcoming cultural festival as their stage. Alexander Royce sat near the back of the room, his jaw tightening as he listened. The cultural festival was a beloved event, a celebration of unity and diversity that drew thousands from across the region. For the network, it was the perfect symbol to attack, the chance to turn joy into fear. We've identified potential targets within the festival grounds, Vance continued, gesturing to the map. Main entry points, stages, and high-traffic areas. Bombs have already been planted, designed to detonate in a coordinated strike. The architect's message is clear. They want to tear this city apart. The room buzzed with tension as officers discussed strategies to dismantle the network. Bomb squads were dispatched to sweep the festival grounds, while undercover agents blended into the crowds to monitor for suspicious activity. Alexander, however, couldn't shake a gnawing feeling in his gut. Victor had boasted about the network's reach, and now the architect loomed as an even greater threat. He knew that stopping a single attack wouldn't dismantle the ideology fueling this movement. That night, Alexander joined a small team tasked with patrolling the festival grounds. He moved through the bustling streets in plain clothes, his eyes scanning every corner. Families strolled past, children clutching balloons, and musicians filled the air with lively tunes. The festival brimmed with life and hope, the very things the architect sought to destroy. Through his earpiece, updates poured in. Sector 3 clear, one officer reported. No sign of explosives. But then, a chilling discovery changed everything. A bomb squad located the first device hidden beneath a stage. It was sophisticated, an intricate web of wires connected to a remote detonator, and it wasn't alone. We found 2 more devices, another officer reported. Different locations, all active. Alexander's heart pounded as he relayed the information to Captain Vance. They've spread them out, he said. This isn't just one strike, it's a chain reaction. Vance's voice crackled through the comms. Disarm what we can, but we need to find the architect. They're the only one who can call this off completely. As the night wore on, Alexander's vigilance intensified. His every step carried the weight of lives at stake. And then, he saw them. Near a secluded alley behind the main stage, a figure stood watching the festival. Dressed in plain clothes, they were unremarkable at first glance, but something about their demeanor felt off. They were too still, too focused. Alexander moved closer, his instincts screaming. The figure turned slightly, and Alexander caught a glimpse of their face, a fleeting moment of recognition from an image shown during the briefing. It was the architect. Alexander's heart raced as he reached for his earpiece. I've got eyes on the architect, he whispered. Alley behind the main stage, moving to intercept. But before backup could arrive, the architect spotted him. Their eyes locked for a moment, and then they bolted, disappearing into the crowd. Alexander gave chase, weaving through the festival as panic surged through him. The architect was slippery, vanishing into the labyrinth of booths and throngs of people. By the time the team regrouped, the architect had vanished, leaving behind only the chaos they had planned. Back at the command center, Captain Vance's face was grim. They're still out there, he said, and we're running out of time. Alexander clenched his fists. The festival might have been spared for now, but he knew this fight was far from over. Somewhere in the city, the architect was still plotting, and their next move would be even more devastating. The architect had vanished, but their plans lingered like a storm cloud over the city. The festival had been spared thanks to quick action, but the investigation revealed an even darker truth. The planted bombs were just the beginning. Intelligence recovered from Victor Lang's devices pointed to a final, devastating strike planned for the city's heart. Captain Vance stood at the center of the briefing room, his voice sharp and commanding. We've traced communications to a remote compound on the outskirts of the city. The architect is there, along with their inner circle. This is it. their base of operations. If we act now, we can stop this before it's too late. The room buzzed with tension as the team reviewed their plans. The compound was heavily guarded, fortified with armed sentinels and surveillance systems. It wouldn't be easy, but the stakes left no room for hesitation. Alexander Royce prepared in silence, his mind replaying the past weeks. The hate, the threats, the bombs, it all led to this. As he strapped on his tactical gear, Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her face pale but resolute. "You don't have to do this," she said softly, her hands trembling. He turned to her, his gaze steady. "Yes, I do. If we don't stop them, they'll tear this city apart. I won't let that happen." Eleanor stepped closer, placing a hand on his chest. "Promise me you'll come back." "I promise," he said, though his voice carried the weight of uncertainty. The night was pitch black as the team approached the compound, their movements silent and deliberate. Drones buzzed overhead, feeding live surveillance to their earpieces. Guards patrolled the perimeter, armed and alert. "Move in," Vance's voice crackled over the comms. The operation began with precision. The team breached the gates, their movements swift and coordinated. Gunfire erupted, the darkness lit by bursts of muzzle flash. Alexander pushed forward, clearing room after room as his heart pounded like a war drum. Finally, they reached the central chamber. A cavernous space lined with monitors displaying live feeds of the city. At the center of the room stood the architect, their back to the team, their figure calm and composed. "Don't move," Alexander barked, his weapon trained on the shadowy figure. The architect turned slowly, their face illuminated by the glow of the screens. They were older than he had expected, with sharp, calculating eyes that betrayed no fear. "You've come all this way," the architect said, their voice smooth and cold. "And yet you still don't understand. This isn't about bombs or chaos. It's about awakening the truth." Alexander's finger hovered near the trigger. "Your truth is built on hate and destruction. It ends tonight." The architect smiled faintly. "You think killing me will stop this? People like me don't vanish. Someone else will rise. The idea is bigger than me, bigger than you." Their hand moved toward a console, but Alexander reacted instantly, firing a single shot. The bullet struck the console, sparks flying as the device short-circuited. The architect raised their hands, their smirk fading into a glare. The team moved in, securing the room and arresting the architect. As they were led away, they turned back to Alexander. "You may have stopped me, but the seed has been planted. You can't kill an idea." The aftermath was a mix of relief and weariness. The raid had dismantled the network, uncovering plans for further attacks and cutting off their resources. The city had been saved, but Alexander knew the fight wasn't truly over. As he returned home that night, Eleanor ran to him, embracing him tightly. "It's over?" she asked, her voice trembling. "For now," he replied, his tone heavy. She looked into his eyes, searching for reassurance. "And if they come back?" Alexander placed a hand on her cheek, his gaze steady. "Then we'll stand against them. Together." In the quiet of the night, Alexander stood by the window, staring out at the city. The lights twinkled like stars, a symbol of hope that had endured despite the darkness. He knew the battle against hate wasn't one that could be won overnight, but it was a fight worth continuing. For his city, for his family, and for the belief that love and unity could conquer fear. As dawn broke, Alexander felt a renewed resolve. No matter how many times they rose, he would stand ready to face them, knowing that strength wasn't in the fight, but in the refusal to ever back down. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our latest videos. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Thank you all for taking the time to watch, and see you in the next video.